Coming up on We Talk News this week, the big are getting bigger in cannabis as Trulieve takes over the lead as the largest cannabis MSO in the country, with Curaleaf, Air Wellness, and the parent company all making major acquisitions this week. A former law enforcement officer, now Republican state senator in Pennsylvania, files a legal adult use bill in that medical-only state. And we have reaction from one of that state's most well-known cannabis advocates. Plus, Justin Bieber adds his name to the list of celebrities in the cannabis market with his Peaches pre-rolls by Palms. All this and more on We Talk News next.
We are Pro Cannabis Media.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jimmy Young from Pro Cannabis Media, and this is We Talk News. So, did anybody notice that Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp disappeared for a few hours on Monday? I know I was upset that I missed a few of my friends' birthdays, but otherwise I heard about it on the news. And was it just a coincidence that a whistleblower named Frances Haugen was on 60 Minutes on Sunday spilling her story about how that company puts profits ahead of just about everything? So, what does this have to do with cannabis, you ask? Well, let's just say I don't think Mark Zuckerberg inhaled when he was at Harvard, since their community guidelines do everything they can to make it difficult for cannabis companies to survive or even use that platform like other businesses do. Now, I know Pro Cannabis Media can't boost our posts on Facebook, and there are many other stories about cannabis-related groups struggling to use the popular platform for their businesses. Now, one cannapreneur from Cannavision in LA is Fred Smith, who, along with PCM friend Rico Lamitte, share information on a regular basis on Facebook Live. Fred explains his story and his journey of a group of business people who have managed to survive and thrive on that platform.
So I had about 2,200 people in my group. I was coaching them through the pandemic, and I was showing them how to play nicely in the sandbox. I was showing the liberals and the conservatives and the optimists and the pessimists and whatever you called yourself. Like literally, I got everybody singing Kumbaya. And these were 2,200 sometimes of the world's top people literally in that group. I had a 92% engagement rate. And I'm saying this to say this. We didn't get kicked off because we were considered a MAGA group. We didn't get kicked off because we were considered a Q group. We didn't get kicked off because we were considered a conspiracy theory group. So I single-handedly jicked their algorithm, and it couldn't deplatform me, period. It made Reuters news, everybody who was getting kicked off who had groups like me at that time. That's how big this really is. So come around January 17th and 18th, I'm down in Nashville of this year, and they're still trying to deplatform me, okay? So all of those 2,200 people, I literally had to take off my Facebook timeline, or I was gonna get like deplatformed forever. And that's a huge deal on Facebook, and I'll tell you why. So I had to go through the Facebook Council, the Thought Police, and all this other stuff. Right, it's big, dude. Like I'm telling you, this is huge. They do not play. I'm gonna explain to you why. Because it makes sense, but I think we have a fundamental misunderstanding across all levels, because I'm an old school guy. As you know, I'm a broadcaster from about 20 years ago. I learned this stuff, right? So I've had to learn, and I'm very traditional. I went through the top schools in the military to learn this stuff. So what's going on with Facebook right now is real simple. The people have awakened and they don't know how to handle it, period. You can't smoke this much weed and not expect a conscious transformation, Jimmy.
Okay, fair enough.
Is that fair? Is that fair?
Yes, and I can relate to that. You know that.
Right.
Okay, keep going.
Last year on record, legal sales were the highest ever, no pun intended. So you just can't expect people to just be who they were. You know what I'm saying? It's just like it's getting really above average really quick. But I saw the trend and Facebook really didn't. So what happens is they get hit with a buzzsaw and now they have to respond. But here's the problem. And a lot of people have talked about this before me. Facebook has you literally in an augmented reality on their website. There's a lot of relevancy. It's not like MySpace where back in the day, you know, you could just do blah, blah, blah. No, you've got your credit cards tied to it. You've got your passwords tied to it. It's a lot of stuff going on. So because they were a social media platform, and I actually posted this on my Facebook page just even before me and you talked, I asked a simple question. I said, is Facebook a utility?
I think
because
Facebook is a media company, but go ahead.
right, but they're acting also like a utility at this
Oh,
point.
yes. Right. Because we opt in for their communication services.
100%. But here's now how I understand Facebook now, like in real time, because I'm working with some of the world's top marketers literally in real time on this stuff. Facebook is no more than an advertising platform.
Right.
So that's how they get paid. That's how they're just a giant billboard stuck on the top of the earth. They've got a lot of juice to push out messaging. Okay. Yep. So now that they've been commoditized, and now that people are more concerned about their information and privacy and GDPR and everything else, people have forgotten to realize that as they shifted, so has Facebook. So this is where we're having the clunkiness of how Facebook needs to define themselves. Mm-hmm. I'm not sitting here defending Facebook, because I literally almost got deplatformed this year. Facts. And I have everything to prove that.
Yep.
So what I am saying, though, is that once I understood that thing, then I got a brain transplant. Next thing you know, I'm playing nicely in the sandbox. Next thing you know, my strikes are going down. Next thing you know, I'm with Peter Pan hanging out. We're all singing Kumbaya. Okay. You know, and now my monetization's going back up. They're like, hey, who is this magic Negro? He just came out of nowhere. It's like, well, guys, I don't hate you. Like, you got to understand something. I'm just a regular person. So what happened as a result of that, though, is even going down to the last couple of days, I had already told people that they can expect something like this to happen, because it was just meant to happen.
Well, it did, and there are plenty of other stories of social media platforms like YouTube who will take down videos and flag them, even if you're doing news and educational content similar to what we do here on Pro Cannabis Media regularly. As you know, we tell the stories of the cannabis industry in their own words. And of course, what we're trying to do is inform the public of what the industry is trying to share with them. In fact, last week's news got flagged until I appealed and won. And now we are back sharing the stories of the industry in their own words. We'll be talking about social media censorship on our weekly Green Rush Live Business of Cannabis show on Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, one of our guests is expected to be one of the founders of the Weed Tube, Aaron Richard, who started his platform when YouTube pulled the plug on his content. And he's not the only one, unless, of course, YouTube decides to flag us between now and then. In the meantime, we start our state-by-state roundup with the executive director of NORML in Michigan. He's our own Cannacaster, Rick Thompson. Rick?
Well, good day to you. This is the Michigan Report with Rick Thompson on Weed Talk News. Let's begin. Canada has a 3-year oversupply of cannabis, so it's no wonder the international borders in states like Michigan and New York have seen an uptick in smuggling operations. Customs and Border Protection officials this year alone have seized nearly 15,000 pounds of cannabis at 3 Michigan-Canada border crossings. Now that's 7 times as much as the 2,189 pounds seized in 2018. Detroit, the nation's busiest border crossing, has seen the lion's share of smuggling operations. Most of the Canadian cannabis intercepted in Detroit is usually headed for states where cannabis is still illegal and prices are high, like Tennessee, the Carolinas, and Georgia. In New York, specifically Buffalo, 1,071 pounds of cannabis were seized in 2016 at border crossings versus 41,000 pounds in fiscal year 2021. The demand is so great because Canadian cannabis can sell for as much as $3,000 to $5,000 a pound on the illicit market. A special notice was issued by the Marijuana Regulatory Agency regarding more than 1 1/2 pounds of contaminated marijuana packaged and sold at licensed retailers in the state. The cannabis failed testing for microbial content. Now, Michigan has strict regulations regarding cannabis which fails testing, and this cannabis certainly did fail testing, yet it made it out to retail shelves and into the lungs of human consumers. When asked by media how this happened, how it was discovered, where the contamination originated from, and what happened to the rest of the 50-pound batch of cannabis this retail product came from, the regulatory agency said, "No comment, but watch for more on this story." The cannabis producer has been identified as Glow from Kalkaska, a small farm with a 500-plant license. The testing lab, which initially approved the cannabis only to have it test bad later, is as yet unidentified. Stay tuned for more updates on this story. And October 5th featured an all-important hearing in the House Regulatory Reform Committee regarding a package of bills intended to deliver monopoly to a few cannabis companies in Michigan by slashing the state's 12-year-old medical caregiver laws. The lines were clearly divided. On one side, a small group of paid public relations professionals and lobbyists and their legislative allies, and on the other, 150 angry patients, parents, cannabis consumers, and citizen voters. In the end, it was the big money interests which won out in the Republican-dominated committee. The business guys and government employees were given 1 hour and 15 minutes to speak. Yet the people were gifted a mere 20 minutes, barely enough time for 5 people to testify. A second hearing is required before a vote can be taken, but that hearing isn't required to accept testimony, and the hard-hearted committee chairman, Rep. Hauk, says he will not allow the people to have a further day to speak. Now, this is the culmination of the story we've been weaving here on Weed Talk News for months now. The outrage felt by average people over the direction the cannabis industry is headed, and the people who appear to be in the driver's seat. There's more to come on this very important topic. And that's it for the Michigan Report with Rick Thompson on Weed Talk News.
Pennsylvania is one of 36 states with a medical marijuana program in the United States, and it's one of the most interesting states because of the mix of different politics between the big cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, where it's decriminalized, and the rural areas where it is still illegal to possess even small amounts of cannabis. A Republican state senator there, who is a former law enforcement officer named Mike Regan, introduced a bill this week to legalize adult use of cannabis. Now, Regan is the chair of the Senate Justice Committee in PA, and that bill includes adult use, a regulatory control board, protecting the rights of the existing medical marijuana patients, and one of the biggest aspects of his proposal includes the provision that gun owners will no longer be excluded from getting a license to carry if they use cannabis. Will Edelstein, a cannabis advocate in that state, who was a guest on my podcast In the Weeds this week, was pleased that was part of this plan. Allow for legal purchase, possession of firearms, regardless of one's choice to use marijuana.
I fully stand behind that one.
Okay.
That makes it the best thing ever said by a politician so far. I'll give it that, because one of the biggest problems in Pennsylvania is sometimes people choose having their concealed carry permit over getting their medical marijuana card, and that, I think, is a sad thing. And so I appreciate you bringing that to my attention, because that is a pain point in Pennsylvania that is talked about in my business, in my communities, time and time again. And especially where we're at right now, it's been very intriguing to me how people have opted to have a gun license opposed to getting a license for medical marijuana, and I always say, listen, you got to weigh and determine which one's better for you. So that being a part of his, I guess, body of work for this bill would be great, because I think that's a detriment to the citizens of Pennsylvania, to where they have to make that choice. And it doesn't make sense to me, because everyone on that application lies, which is really funny, because in Pennsylvania, you have to specifically check a box that says you don't use marijuana. And I mean, let's be real. We all know people that use marijuana, but no one really knows about it. So they could check no on that box so they can get their concealed carry permit. So people opt in more so to the traditional market because they don't have to deal with any bullshit. And instead of being able to get products from a dispensary that they might learn some more about, might be able to help them a little bit better, yada, yada, yada. So that's a great point. And shout out to this gentleman, Mr. Mike Regan.
I met Will at the NECANN in Atlantic City, New Jersey this past week, where thousands of people poured into the Showboat Casino to hear our friend Tiramisu Sargente from Blazin' Bakery deliver the keynote address. In fact, they had to bring in extra chairs to accommodate the overflow crowd to hear Tara talk. Other presenters included Green Rush Live co-host David Rabinovitz, who presented on the business and political history of cannabis in the U.S., Dr. Uma Dhanabalan was there as well as new PCM friend, former federal prosecutor Lauren Paxton from Kalgani and Kanefsky, who talked about the differences in employment law in New York and New Jersey, two new states for adult use.
Look, our practice is centered here in Newark, New Jersey, with our New York presence as well in New York City. And we have employers both in and outside the space that have to comply with both sets of laws. The biggest issues now with the wave of legalization is background checks and drug testing and reasonable accommodations for medicinal users, which is an ongoing issue. In New York City, for example, you can no longer test for THC when you're onboarding a new employee. New Jersey, you can, but you can't use that to disqualify an employee for a new job. So there you've already got a nuance that employers in and outside the industry need to be aware of.
Absolutely. And the background checks now in Massachusetts, and of course, this is where Pro Cannabis Media lives, and I've got a little experience talking with dispensary owners about some of the challenges that they've had to face here. The commission actually makes each dispensary do background checks for both adult use employees and for medicinal marijuana employees, even if it's the same employee. It's one of the biggest issues that people that own dispensaries in Massachusetts have. Are there different background checks for the same employee in those different states that you know of?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in New York State, we still have the regulations in process. If we don't have final rules on that yet. New Jersey just put out its rules, and we do have the background check process in place for both. And so folks in the industry will have to go through that process. Outside the industry, employers will still have to observe the background checks. The nuance there is if an employee has a past arrest or conviction for a marijuana offense that is no longer illegal due to recent changes in the law, that employee cannot be denied an opportunity of employment. And that's a big change for New Jersey employers.
I think the NECAN show, well, in particular, most NECAN shows where the market is established are good, especially on the B2B side. This New Jersey show and the upcoming New York show, those are emerging markets. So you get a flux of people just like, hey, I want to get into the business. I'm just checking it out to see what's going on. And that's where the opportunity really arrives. Your established markets, they're ongoing. Maybe their licenses are still in process, but they've made the call. They know what they want to do. So, yeah, I like NECAN versus versus a Canacon, say. Not that Canacon's bad, but that's mostly people looking, hey, I want to get into grow. Hey, not so much the dispensary side. Just trying to figure out the legalities and outdoor, indoor, dispensary, processor.
The state of New York's new control board of cannabis made some news this week by permanently waiving the $50 registration fee for patients and caregivers. They also approved whole flower as a medical cannabis product. Not sure how long it took them to realize that one. And then they implemented a 60-day supply for those medical patients and caregivers. Now it's time for our report from the Green Mountain state of Vermont. Here's Vermont's green nurse, Jessie Lynn Dolan. Jessie Lynn?
Thanks, Jimmy. I'm Jessie Lynn Dolan from Nurse Grown Organics and Vermont Cannabis Nurses, and this is the Weed Talk News Vermont Report. Vermont's Cannabis Control Board provided the first look at proposed cannabis license fees last week. Discussion covered models and estimates for the retail cost of cannabis, licensing and production possibilities, including the size of cultivation on total canopy versus flowering canopy. Though the proposed fees are not yet finalized, the board expects to move quickly and vote on proposed fees in the next 2 weeks. The University of Vermont has just rolled out their 3-part virtual series on hemp marketing risk. The first hemp webinar was October 6th, entitled Researching the Market. Is there a market for the hemp you plan to grow? The next webinar will be on October 13th and again on October 20th. For more information, visit the UVM Extension Northwest Crops and Soils program online. CannaFest, hosted by Olga Maria, the Latino libertarian, will be Sunday, October 17th in the Northeast Kingdom. Don't miss out on the farmers and artisan market, kids activities, speakers, musicians, and much, much more. Visit cannafestvt.com for tickets. That's the Vermont Report for Weed Talk News. I'm Vermont's cannabis nurse, Jessie Lynn Dolan.
In our weekly MSO report, who's the biggest cannabis company in the United States right now? Well, I guess that all depends on what criteria you use for that. Florida-based Trulieve acquired Harvest Health and Recreation this week, and if you combine their earnings for the second quarter of this year, that total is $317 million. Curaleaf of Massachusetts, along with Air Wellness and the parent company, also made acquisitions this week totaling over $212 million. Now it's time for the DC Report. Here's Vote Pro Podcast, Phil Adams. Phil.
Hi, I'm Phil Adams with Vote Pro Podcast, here with the Weed Talk News DC Report. A federal financial regulator is urging Congress to act now on cannabis banking reform. Rodney Hood, board member and former chairman of the National Credit Union Administration, in an article for MarijuanaMoment.net, said that the time is now to update federal banking laws to accommodate the burgeoning legal cannabis industry. Hood said many would be surprised to learn that credit unions and other financial services providers can legally do business with companies in the cannabis industry so long as they comply with anti-money laundering laws, practice due diligence, and meet other basic requirements. However, most credit unions and banks are reluctant to serve the industry because of vague and outdated federal guidance. Current federal restrictions mean that thousands of state-licensed cannabis businesses are unable to accept credit cards, deposit revenues, access loans, or write checks to meet payroll or pay taxes. Last week, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced that no cannabis banking reform bill would advance ahead of a comprehensive legalization bill. Schumer said that he and Senate colleagues Ron Wyden of Oregon and Cory Booker of New Jersey have agreed to block banking reform in the Senate until a legalization bill is advanced. In July, the three senators introduced such a bill. The Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act would deschedule cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act, expunge prior convictions, allow for resentencing of those currently incarcerated on cannabis convictions, among other provisions. Unlike the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, however, which was recently approved by a key House committee, the CAOA does not fully address enforcement disparities or investment in communities impacted by the war on drugs. Hood contends that passage of some form of federal cannabis legalization is a foregone conclusion. In the meantime, taking action to clarify banking rules for cannabis companies would go a long way toward easing the uncertainty and stigma around serving the cannabis industry. Hood also outlined some regulatory steps that can be taken in the interim. To that end, Hood has formally requested the establishment of a working group under the auspices of the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council to develop a preliminary framework for regulatory compliance. That's the Weed Talk News DC Report for this week. I'm Phil Adams from Vote Pro Podcast.
Now, we all know that cannabis is still a federally illegal substance, and those in the industry know that all plant-touching businesses have to pay their taxes in cash in some way. So the IRS decides they want to help, and they've even created a landing page on their website for their new cannabis/marijuana initiative. You can find that at irs.gov/marijuana. There, the IRS gives guidance for legal state operators on how to file their taxes and how to deal with that cursed 280E code that disallows normal business expenses. Very nice, right? However, they also want the illegal market to file and said, quote, "The Internal Revenue Code doesn't differentiate between income derived from legal sources and income derived from illegal sources. It's all income and it's taxable." That's what the IRS explains. In California, of course, there's more legal and illegal weed being grown and distributed all over the world, and there is one person who can keep track of all of that. It's our own Christopher Smith from the American Cannabis Report. Here's his report from the Golden State. Christopher?
I'm Christopher Smith, publisher of the American Cannabis Report, bringing you the roundup from the great cannabis state of California for Weed Talk News. William Shakespeare asked, "What's in a name?" And 2 months ago, the Cleveland Indians became the Cleveland Guardians. Squaw Valley Ski Resort is now Palisades Tahoe. So for too long, language has been weaponized in the war on cannabis, like Authorities fight to keep marijuana from being diverted from the recreational market to the black market. Californians prefer cannabis from the regulated or adult use sources instead of illicit ones. What are you waiting for, Washington football team? Now, Governor Gavin Newsom has just signed legislation to end mandatory minimum jail sentences for nonviolent drug offenses. Mass incarceration of nonviolent drug offenders has not reduced drug use or addiction, but has been used as a tool to unfairly punish communities of color. Representative Barbara Lee tweeted, "Ending mandatory jail time for nonviolent drug crimes is a huge step in the fight to keep black and brown folks out of jail cells. Decriminalization and legalization of cannabis are next." The coastal California town of San Luis Obispo announced it was revoking a business license for a cannabis shop called Natural Healing Center because its owner, Helios Dayspring, a real name in California, pleaded guilty to 2 felony charges this summer. Natural Healing Center is one of 3 retailers granted an initial permit, and now there are 2. And just up the coast, a California jury has decided the nation's first cannabis industry antitrust case, according to a national law review. A cannabis collective proved that its only competitor tried to strangle its real estate permit by going door to door to convince landlords not to rent property to the plaintiff, created fake leases, letters of intent, and purchase agreements to tie the landlords up with paper until the clock ran out, all for naught. Well, not quite not. The cha-ching on this little caper was $5 million. And it was a matter of time before another white celebrity got into the cannabis game. Justin Bieber has launched Peaches in collaboration with a California grower called Palms. Fortunately, this new gig is not a total neck tattoo. He is using the venture to support nonprofits, including Veterans Walk and Talk, which advocates for the medicinal use of cannabis within the military veteran community, and the Last Prisoner Project, which is dedicated to criminal justice reform around cannabis convictions. And I'm Christopher Smith for the American Cannabis Report, beaming in from Cannabis Heaven, California, for Weed Talk News.
Now it's time for news from the Bay State of Massachusetts, one of the hottest markets in cannabis over the past few years since adult use was introduced in 2016. Forefront Ventures has acquired mass-based cultivator New England Cannabis Cultivator this week for $55 million. Forefront is from Arizona, and now their canopy in the Bay State has increased to 30,000 square feet. Here's Ron Marshalsea with more from the Bay State in his Cannabis Report. Ron?
I'm Ron Marshalsea with the Massachusetts Cannabis Report for Weed Talk News. Forefront Ventures, a multi-state cannabis operator and retailer, announced today that it has signed definitive agreements to acquire New England Cannabis Corporation, a best-in-class cannabis cultivator with state-of-the-art facilities based in Holliston, Massachusetts. The cannabis market in this state is only getting bigger, and Forefront has already introduced its full suite of popular brands in Massachusetts, which have achieved wide-scale consumer support. The company expects the acquisition of NECC to significantly expand Forefront's presence and enable broader market penetration of their diverse range of low-cost, high-quality products and brands. The transaction will more than double Forefront's total flower canopy in Massachusetts to over 30,000 square feet, with further expansion potential for up to an additional 10,000 square feet. It will also approximately triple Forefront's kitchen, processing, and distribution space. Canadian pop star Justin Bieber is partnering with California-based company Palms to launch a limited edition marijuana product that ties into a song from his most recent album. The product went on sale starting Monday at certain dispensaries in 4 states, including Netta's 2 locations in Northampton and Brookline, Massachusetts. Bieber said in an emailed statement that he hopes his partnership with Palms will help to fight the common stigma about marijuana use. I'm a fan of Palms and what they are doing by making cannabis approachable and helping to destigmatize it, especially for the many people who find it helpful for their mental health. Bieber's product is a package of pre-rolled joints and a branded lighter that are named Peaches. That's this week's Massachusetts Cannabis Report. For Weed Talk News, I'm Ron Marshalsea.
The show me state is Missouri, and that's where we'll find Brandon Jones, our newest Cannacaster on Weed Talk News. He keeps us up to date on what's going on there. Brandon?
Thanks, Jimmy. I'm Brandon Jones with Distribution Maven with Missouri Cannabis Report for Weed Talk News. My first story today comes out of Mo Greenway. Toigo versus DHSS begins today. Nearly 4 months after U.S. District Judge Nanette Lowry ruled in favor of Mark Toigo and granted a preliminary injunction, the trial begins. At the center of the case is a requirement that Missouri licensed medical marijuana businesses are to be owned in majority by Missouri residents. The preliminary injunction granted by Judge Lowry restricted the state from enforcing those residency requirements as they pertain to investment and ownership of medical marijuana licenses granted by the state. Toigo's lawsuit filed in December 2020 argues that the state Missouri's enforcement of the residency requirement is discriminatory and violates the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Obviously, this is a very big story. This is something that has national implications and could be a trendsetter. Obviously, you don't want to set the wrong precedent here in Missouri, so I'm really hoping that this residency requirement is something that stays. My second story today comes out of Outvoices, Kansas City. And this is a little bit of a happier story. 150th Missouri medical cannabis dispensary approved to operate. Missouri's newest medical cannabis dispensary has been approved to operate in Kansas City, making it the 150th such facility to start in retails less than 1 year ago. So local cannabis plans to operate its retail and later this month within Smithville's cannabis and cultivation property to open by the end of 2021. Missouri's medical cannabis sales are to approach and surpass 200 million by the end of this year. So thanks again, Jimmy. I'm Brandon Jones with Distribution Maven with the Missouri Cannabis Report for Weed Talk News. Have a great day.
And finally, Justin Bieber and weed. Yes, the pop star lives in LA, but is originally from Georgia. So he decides that getting into the cannabis business with pre-rolls called Peaches from a California manufacturer named Palms was a good thing. So he wrote a song about it. The lyrics, I got my peaches out of Georgia. I get my weed from California. Only in America. That's Weed Talk News for this week. I'm Jimmy Young from Pro Cannabis Media. Remember, it's a whole new world of weed out there. Use it responsibly.
PCM TV is supported by Salient Systems, a world leader in video management security, and by Revolutionary Clinics, a medical dispensary where the patient comes first, and by Accounting Buds, your #1 CPA specialist for the cannabis industry.
Weed Talk and In the Weeds are two productions of Pro Cannabis Media supported by Revolutionary Clinics, one of the top medical cannabis dispensaries in the Massachusetts area, now with 3 locations in Greater Boston, 2 in Cambridge and 1 on Broadway in Somerville. Rev Clinics has a patient-first mission. They will customize your needs as a medical patient with the proper titration and combination of strains, flavors, and products. Rev Clinics, where the patient comes first.
Difference is building a solution for that individual. Not just a custom, here's a box, here's a video, here's how you make your VMS. We custom design and custom build every situation for exactly what the customer needs. And we keep the costs low. We have multiple tiers, as far as what you're looking at on the cost side of things. If you want a one-time, where you just pay one initial cost, we have that. If you want to maintain your system and have the highest protection and highest capabilities and highest upgrades at all times, we have different plans for you. But we scale it so it's scalable and affordable 100%.
Pro Cannabis Media programming is available live and on demand on our Facebook page at Pro Canna Media, on Instagram at Pro Cannabis Media, on LinkedIn also at Pro Cannabis Media, on YouTube and YouTube Live on Pro Cannabis Media, Twitter at Pro Canna Media, and on twitch.tv/Pro Cannabis Media. So like, share, and subscribe to all of our content, newsletters, and shows live or on demand.
We are Pro Cannabis Media.